Question 5. Can we reinvent ourselves and create with thought alone, without physically doing anything?
This is a brilliant question, and the answer to the question is absolutely yes. We've talked in the Art of Change CD about 3 brains that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being. Neocortex is the thinking brain. That is that walnut on the outside with all of its folds and valleys. That's the seat of your conscious awareness. You're listening right now with your neocortex, and it gathers information from the environment. And as you learn new things and make new connections in your brain, you begin to add a new stitch to the 3-dimensional tapestry of your gray matter. Now, when you take that information and you apply it or demonstrate or personalize it and you change your behavior in some way, you have a new experience which produces a new emotion, and you activate a second brain called the limbic brain or the chemical brain or the emotional brain. Now, when you have a new experience, you have a new emotion that's created from that experience. So you read the book on success, you learn all that information, you apply exactly what the book says, and when the first check comes and you have your new experience, that new experience produces an emotion called success. And the moment you feel successful, you are teaching your body emotionally what your mind intellectually understood. So if knowledge is for the mind, then experience is for the body. And in that moment, your body is getting signaled genetically by types of genes called experience-dependent genes or behavior-dependent genes, which literally begin to cause the genes to express proteins in a different way, and you begin to signal them to create a new identity. We could say that you're embodying knowledge in that moment. The word is becoming flesh. Now, if you keep repeating the experience over and over again, and you can reproduce wealth or success enough times, we activate a third brain called the cerebellum. That's the memory center, the subconscious center of the body and the brain. In other words, you've done it so many times that you no longer have to think about it, and you've conditioned your body neurochemically to memorize success as well as your conscious mind, and now you are being successful. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine that was a very wealthy man a couple years ago, and we sat down to lunch, and he sat across from me, and he said, today I lost everything that I owned. And then he said, pass me the ketchup. And I kind of slid the ketchup across the table, still making eye contact with him, and he was sticking this hamburger in his mouth, and I looked at him and I said, Jerry, you okay? And with a mouthful of food, he said, what's wrong? I said, well, you just told me that you lost everything that you owned today. And he kind of looked at me with this wide-eyed look, and he said, what are you talking about? I am wealth. I'll make it back in 2 weeks. I'm not worried. Now go ahead and eat. In other words, he was so busy being wealth that he didn't see it as loss at all. He is wealth. And when we get to that point where we are in a state of being, when mind and body are one, that's when we know that we know. It's a skill. It's a habit. It's an automatic program. It is our nature. It is innate in us. Now, our job is to go from thinking to doing to being. But based on what you learned in this CD, it is absolutely possible for you to go from thinking to being without actually doing anything. As you begin to rehearse a new ideal of yourself, as you begin to think about a new way of being, as you begin to question and speculate new possibilities, by you mentally rehearsing, and remember, when people played the piano and physically learned scales and chords, according to certain research in neuroscience, as they learned new scales and chords and they practiced them every day and they repeated and they paid attention, they grew new circuits on the opposite side of the brain. The people who mentally rehearsed playing the scales and chords grew the same amount of circuits in their brain as the people who physically demonstrated it. Now, I use this example because their brains changed just by thought alone. Now, when you're mentally rehearsing a new ideal of yourself, a new personality, how a great person would think, how they would act, how they would behave, how they would walk, how they would speak, and you allow yourself to go, just like those piano players, you're beginning every single day to remind yourself who you want to be. And as you remind yourself who you want to be, you're reproducing the same level of mind, and your brain will begin to change just like those piano players. Now, if you pay attention to the exclusion of everything else, and you keep going over and over again, there'll come a moment as you remind yourself that the thought will literally become the experience, and you will begin to experience what it feels like to be that new ideal, because the end product of an experience is called a feeling. And the moment you begin to feel, because the thought became more real, that's the moment your body, as the unconscious mind, is believing that it's in that event physically. And you're beginning to signal new genes in new ways. And if you go from thinking to feeling without doing anything, because the thought in the meditative process is the experience, and you move into that state of being, you've just gone from thinking to being. Now, when you can move into that state of being, memorize what that feels like, you are generating a whole new electromagnetic signature. And if you can memorize that internal order so completely, neurologically and chemically, and you get up different than when you sat down because you're thinking and feeling differently, your mind and body are functioning physiologically different, and you can maintain that modified state of mind and body, that level of coherence, independent of your external world, independent of the people that you know and the places that you go and the things in your environment that trigger you back to the old self. If you're in a higher energetic frequency and you are maintaining this modified state of mind and body, the state of being, we could say that you're more prone to do things and think things equal to who you're being. So the beauty, because of the size of the frontal lobe, is that we can prime our brain and body to be ahead of time. We can move into an elevated state with such coherence that the external environment is no longer controlling how we think and feel. How we think and feel is beginning to control the external environment. And that is my definition of a master. A master is someone who memorizes an internal order in any condition in his or her external environment.
Question 6. How does a new personality create a new personal reality?
A new personality creates a new personal reality. In one of the workshops that I taught around the world, a woman stood up and shared her story, which I found to be quite illuminating. In a moment of understanding, she realized that every decision that she made in her life was based either on a lack of time, a lack of money, or a lack of energy. We could say that she was living in the personality of lack. When she became aware of who she was being, through that metacognitive process, she began to examine the very thoughts and attitudes, the very habits and behaviors, the very choices and emotions that defined her, and she became conscious of those unconscious states of mind and body. And with a very firm decision, she said to herself, I will no longer be this person. I am going to remind myself every day to not live in lack. And in a sense, she was denaturing or dismantling all the aspects of the old self. And as she was beginning to do that and no longer allowing the thoughts, behaviors, and feelings to feed the body to reaffirm its identity, energy began to become liberated out of her body, and it started to move from her body into the field around her. As she began to decide who she was going to be and remind herself every day the choices she was going to make, what thoughts she was going to put her attention behind or her energy behind, what behaviors she wanted to demonstrate in reality, and what emotions or energy she wanted to live by, maybe abundance or security, or that all her needs were met. She began to remind herself of a new personality, a new state of being. And she was finishing with the last patient in her office. And the last patient said to her, you know, in France, we buy a lottery ticket in the middle of the month. Are you going to buy a lottery ticket? And she was about ready to unconsciously say, based on the old self, no. But instead, she just looked at this woman and didn't say anything. Now, as she drove home from work that day, she stopped to get gas, and when she stopped to get gas, she remembered what was said to her, and she just made the choice to buy a lottery ticket. She threw the lottery ticket on the floor, and then for a week she drove around in her car to and from work with that lottery ticket, and one day after work she stopped to buy pizza for her family, and when she got home, she brought the pizza in, and I guess some of the pizza spilled on the seat of the car. The grease spilled on the car. And she picked up the pizzas and the lottery ticket, and she brought it into the house and went into the garage to clean the car off. In a matter of moments, her husband comes running in to the garage and said, "You're not going to believe this. We just won $53,000 in the lottery." Now, new personality, new personal reality. She literally became somebody else, and by making different choices that were no longer connected to the old self, she was living in a state of being where all of her needs were met. Incidentally, she was in debt for that exact amount, $53,000. And she said when she had the microphone, "The next time this happens, I'm going to say all my needs are met and a little bit more." So, when you change from the old self to the new self, and you generate a whole new electromagnetic signature that matches an electromagnetic signature in the quantum field where all your needs are met, an unusual event is going to show up in your life to reaffirm who you're being, and the universe is going to organize that event in a way that's right for you. And it's going to handle the details. And all you have to do is maintain that modified state of being and not return back to the old self. New personality, new personal reality. There was a man who came to one of our events a little ways back who in the past noticed a black spot on his face. And his family, especially his wife, had been bothering him to get it checked out, and he continued on saying he didn't really need to get it checked out, he was fine. And one day he was in an elevator in an office building getting ready to go to his office, and standing next to him was a dermatologist on the elevator. And the dermatologist looked at him and said, "Can I look at your face?" And they stepped outside the elevator, and he said, "I want you to come into my office right away. I think this is a malignant cancer." And so over a course of a short amount of time, this gentleman had this particular tumor frozen, cut out, and radiated. And within a very short span of a few months, another tumor grew on his neck, a little larger. And so he went back to the dermatologist, and then he had it frozen, he had it cut out, and then he had it irradiated. And within a very short amount of time, another tumor appeared on his rib cage, a little bit larger. And he went back to the dermatologist, and he had it frozen, cut out, and radiated. A few months later, another tumor grew on his calf, this time about the size of an apricot. And instead of him rushing back to the doctor, he began to think about all the things that he had learned over the last several years. And he asked himself this simple question: what is this marble rolling around in my brain that keeps this condition coming back? And so he decided to retreat from his life. He wanted to remove himself from all of the external cues that reminded him of who he was as an identity. So he took his wife and packed up his bags and went to Mexico for 10 days. And as he retreated from his life, he was no longer allowing the environment to turn on different circuits in his brain to cause him to think equal to everything he knew in his life. If he wasn't seeing the same people and going to the same place and doing the same things that created the same emotions, by him retreating from his life, he was no longer reaffirming his personality equal to his life. And he went out every day under this palapa, and he sat there, and as he began to think about who he was being in his life, he realized that for the most part, unconsciously, he had been living the last several years of his life in a state of resentment. He just resented everyone and everything, and he just was so used to being it, he memorized it so well, that he just thought that that's who he was, and it was automatic and second nature, and it was unconscious. And as he began to recognize that state of resentment was possibly signaling the cancer gene that caused him to express this tumor, he sat there and he wrote down, he said to himself, when I feel this state of resentment, what thoughts do I think when I feel that way? And he wrote down every single thought that he could think of that was connected to resentment, whether it was connected to a person or a thing or just an unconscious thought. He listed them all out. And he sat there and he reviewed that list the entire day and remembered every single thought. And he said, no thought will ever go by unnoticed that's connected to resentment again. And he made that decision with a very strong intention. And what he was really doing was he was going into the operating system of the subconscious and bringing those unconscious states of mind and body into his awareness so that he had conscious control over it. The next day, he started to think about how he behaved or how he acted when he felt resentment or hatred. And as he began to list all of the behaviors, what he said, how he acted at different points of his life, he began to observe who he was being. He was beginning to objectify his subjective mind. He was no longer the program, he was the observer of the program. And as he began to separate himself from the old self, he started to feel very different. He started to feel light and loose. And he reviewed every one of those behaviors, memorized an entire list, and he began to decide to unlearn those aspects of his habits. And then at the end of the day, those first couple of days, he would throw that list in his mind into the ocean, representing, giving it away. Now, the next couple of days, he looked at what other emotions were generated from resentment. Hate, to be judged, was impatient, and he listed all of those emotions, and he began to observe himself in different situations in his life and looked to see objectively, like reviewing his life from another dimension, who he no longer wanted to be. And he did this for the first 5 days of his vacation. In a very short amount of time, when he became conscious and reminded himself of who he no longer wanted to be when he returned back into his life, he began to liberate enormous amounts of energy, started to break the body from its habituations and its addictions, and the liberation of that energy from the brain and the body produced energy that began to move out from his body and brain into the field. He started to feel joyful, because that's the side effect of breaking an emotional addiction. His body began to become liberated. It didn't want to live in those states, but it had been conditioned and trained to be that way. He started to feel so good that for the next 5 days he began to think about how he was going to live when he returned back to his life, how he was going to think, what thoughts he was going to put his energy behind, what behaviors he was going to demonstrate, how he was going to be at work with his children, with his family. He had all this extra energy to create with, and that energy was the raw materials that he could use to observe a new destiny. And he started to notice every day that he did this that he got lighter and happier, and that he was feeling very differently, and those feelings drove very different thoughts, and he was moving in to a new state of being, a new personality. Well, he packed up his bags from Mexico and his wife, and he returned back to his normal life. And while he was in the shower, the day of the surgery to have that tumor removed off his calf, when he was in the shower and he looked down at that tumor, the tumor had fallen off his leg, literally fell off. And he was so excited that he picked it up and put it in a plastic bag, and he called the doctor's office and he said, "The tumor fell off my leg, what should I do with it?" And the nurses were so excited, they said, "Bring it in, we want to see it." Now, new personality, new personal reality. When he no longer was living in resentment, he was no longer signaling the same gene that kept the same cancer going. When he became somebody else and began to live in an elevated emotion, the new emotion began to signal a new gene, and he switched on new genes and switched off old genes, and the cancer couldn't exist in a new personality. Just like the person you know in your life that's another person besides you, he became somebody else, and there was no room for cancer any longer in that new personality. And so the cancer couldn't exist, and it innately and naturally fell off him. So this shows us then that when we truly change our internal state, when we become somebody else, both neurologically and chemically, there should be effects in our life as a result of our changes.
Question 7. How come I start out with good intentions in the process of reinvention, and I find myself returning to the old self every single day?
This is a great question because it means then the person is aware that they're not changing, and that's the first step. I want to start by answering this question by saying your body is the greatest mind reader there ever was. Your body is made up of cells that are always spying on your brain. Now, if your body is the greatest mind reader that ever was and it's spying on your thoughts, we know then that if you're sitting on the couch with the remote control, with a beer in your hand and eating popcorn, and you want to get in shape, and you think to yourself or you declare out loud, I'm going to get in shape tomorrow. We know that because there's no real strong electrochemical signal going from your brain to your body. It makes sense then that most people don't have enough energetic change in their body to produce a strong signal to cause the body to wake up. So the body says, she's not serious today, he's not serious today. Go on, because we're precognitive enough to know that there is no change going to take place. So, as an example, if you were to sit down and I said to you, 20 out of 21 times I want you to fake standing up. But one time out of those 21 times I actually do want you to stand up. Do you know that every time you fake standing up, there is no physiological change in your body? But the moment you actually do decide to stand up, even before you're consciously aware that you made the decision, the body precognitively knows already that you're going to stand up, and it squirts out a certain amount of adrenaline to keep the same volume of blood going to your brain. So your body, as a precognitive mechanism, is ahead of your conscious mind. So when you're sitting on the couch with the remote control and you're laying horizontal and you say, yeah, I'm going to get in shape or I'm going to change tomorrow, the body already knows as the unconscious mind that for most people, they're not serious, and so it's going to maintain its resting state. Now, when we get to a point in our life where we've reached our lowest point or the ego has been bruised to some degree, and we can't go on business as usual, and we have had loss or trauma or diagnosis or crisis, and all of a sudden we begin to review who we've been. We see what actually got us into this mess in the first place, and we begin to make some very firm decisions to change. Most people will say, I don't care what's going on in my life or what people think. That's the environment. I don't care how I feel. That's the body. I don't care how long it takes. Time. When you say, I'm going to do this, and the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you say it with such firm intention that the decision that you're making is an experience, all of a sudden, remember, the body is the animal to the mind. It's like an unbridled horse that's been trained unconsciously. The moment you say, that is it, I'm making this choice, it's like the rider gets on the horse and pulls those reins in and says, we're riding together now. The body gets such a strong electromagnetic or electrochemical signature that in that moment of such a decision, the body says, she's serious, he's serious, let's get busy changing here. Now, we can do that in a state of pain and suffering, or we can do that in a state of joy and inspiration. My message really is, why wait for pain and suffering? We can wake up in the morning and we can do it just because we can do it, and we can develop it and turn it into a skill. And so when we make a decision to change, it has to be made with an emotional quotient, an energetic signature that becomes an experience and begins to give a signal to the body to let the body, as the unconscious mind, know that the master, the king or the queen, is back on the throne, and now the body must acquiesce to a new mind.
Question 8. How can I break my emotional bonds with other people?
Now, when we meet a person for the first time, what we do is we share our autobiographical self with them. And since our identity is connected completely to everything outside of us, the external environment, and the external environment is basically made up of people, animals, things, places, experiences at different times. Our environment really is every object and every person, animate or inanimate, that we can recall or know that we've experienced. So when we meet a person, we say, hey, I lived in this place. Oh, you lived in that place? I lived in that place. You know those people? I know those people. You've done those things? I've done those things. You've experienced those things? I've experienced those things. Now, if we share the same experiences, then we share the same emotions. Now, just like a sodium ion and a chloride ion, if we share the same emotions, we share the same energy. And it means then we are bonded energetically to everything in our life that we've experienced or interacted with. You have an emotional bond to every person you know, everything you own, whether it's your computer, your car, whether it's your children or your husband or wife. You have an emotional signature energetically that connects you to the place where you work, the desk, everything that you have in your life where you visit energetically and experience, you are bonded to. So we could say then that when you have relationships with people, if you share the same emotions, you share the same energies, and you can relate. Now, the process of change becomes very unique because when you begin to change, and let's say you have a friend in your life that you normally complain with, or you normally, are victims together with, and you share all of your suffering stories with each other, you relate because you're sharing the same emotions. And all of a sudden, you have this stroke of insight and you say, that's it, no more blaming, no more complaining, no more suffering, no more self-pity. I'm going to stop thinking and feeling and behaving this way. Well, the moment you do that, you're beginning to break your energetic bond with that person. And you're beginning to separate yourself energetically in that relationship. And just like it takes a certain amount of energy to break a chloride ion from a sodium ion, to break salt apart, there's a release of the shared energy. That's what makes them bond. That releasing of energy, there's a moment of chaos or there's a moment of disruption. And so when most people start to change and they start breaking their emotional contracts with everybody in their life, those people in their life have been using them for the same reason, and now it's a violation to their identity because that's how they remember who they are. Now this is a classic moment because those people will then do whatever they can to push the same emotional buttons so that you can continue your agreement with them. They don't want you to show up unpredictable or different. They like you better the other way. So when we walk into our life, and we're beginning to make changes, and we're breaking the emotional bonds with everything in our life, we're literally calling energy from these particular elements in our environment back to us. And that energy that begins to move back to us is a little bit chaotic, and it's very unusual, and it's very unfamiliar, and it's very uncomfortable. Now, when most people start to feel this chaos happening to them, they immediately return back to the familiar feeling so that they can remember who they are. They return back to the cues in their environment that reaffirm their identity. And so they start off with an intention of change, and then when they start noticing that they're making that change, there's a period or a void where they can't identify with anything in their environment because they're in the midst of change. If you rush back to the same conditions, you'll return back to the same self. Being in that state of uncertainty, being in that state of unknown, is the exact state that we need to be in order to create a new destiny. So can you become comfortable in the midst of that flux or that period that's void of any markers in your life that cause you to redefine yourself as the old self because the new reality hasn't conformed yet? So most people then, they return back to the familiar so that they can remember who they are, and that moment of uncertainty is the moment in the quantum model where you have available energy to create with. Now, if you can linger in that place of uncertainty and use that energy to begin to create a new destiny, well, you are going to wind up in a whole new life with a whole new set of people, with a whole new set of circumstances, with a whole new reflection to equal who you're being. So if you're addicted to certain emotions now that you've used people for to remember or reaffirm your personality, when you begin to break those addictions and you're freeing your body from the cravings or the enslavement of those strong chemicals, then if you're still addicted to those emotions and you show up in your life and you see a person that you have that agreement with, that person, when you see them, you will automatically or autonomically begin to return back to the old self, because an addiction is when the body is the mind. So you're going to automatically return back to the old identity because it's going to be a reflexive process. When you truly break the addiction in your meditation and you get beyond that aspect of yourself and you sit there and your body is raging and it's telling you you can't do this, you're too much like your mother, you'll never change, this doesn't feel good, you got too much to do. How about that time when you were 14 and you had this experience? And you allow the body to do all that. And you sit there and you wait and you settle it down into the present moment. And you begin to condition it to a new mind, and it begins to acquiesce to your intentions. Then you're taking that addiction and you're turning that emotion into something else. And every time you make the choice to stay with that and push a little further and go beyond that discomfort, when you liberate that energy now and you've broken the addiction in your meditation, and that addiction is no longer within you and you walk back into your life, then you won't reflexively knee-jerk because the addiction isn't in you any longer. So you can see your worst enemy. You could see your ex-husband or your ex-wife. And because you're no longer in that emotional signature any longer, you are in an elevated emotion and you can look at them and see them with compassion because you can see yourself in them. But now you're no longer bonded to them energetically. You're in a whole new frequency. And that's when we begin to demonstrate greater levels of compassion and elevated emotions.
And now an example of breaking your emotional bonds.
So let's talk about an example where we become energetically bonded to somebody in our life that we have an emotional contract or agreement with or an emotional bond with based on some experiences that allow us to stay stuck in the same reality. Because if we're sharing the same emotion every single day with another person and we're reaffirming that emotion on a moment-to-moment basis, if emotions are energy in motion, then our energy is the same as the day before, and it's connected to somebody else, and everything stays status quo because it's the same energy. And as if it's the same energy, particles and reality, which is made up of frequency and energy, stays exactly the same. So I have an employee that has spent some time raising her children by herself. She has a 22-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son, and she was divorced several years ago, and the last 2.5 years, she had received no child support for her children, and her ex-husband lost his job. She tried everything to get her ex-husband to pay child support for her children. And essentially, she was supporting her children by herself. She tried state agencies, she tried attorneys, she tried letters, she tried phone calls, emails. She even had her children call and plead with her father for some type of financial support. And we were in the seminar on one of my workshops, And she normally, at times, stands alongside me to make sure that when we get into a meditation, everybody's taken care of. But this particular group was very refined. So I said to her, why don't you sit down and do the meditation? And we were talking about being bonded emotionally to different people in our life. And we use those people to reaffirm an addiction that we have. And we think it's them that's creating our present state, but we're using them to keep our reality the same. And so she wrestled with this understanding, and she realized that as long as she was addicted to an emotion of survival, she was living as an ego that was selfish. And if she could liberate that energy and forgive and let go and no longer hold on to her relationship energetically the same way, she would free up energy, and there possibly would be another outcome that would surface. So in the meditation, she began to recognize the emotion. She surrendered it. She got clear she wasn't going to think certain ways, act certain ways, feel other feelings. She made the choice to release her husband and herself because those emotions of judgment and resentment and hatred were basically signaling the same genes that could actually cause her to get sick at some future time and keep reality the same. So she truly surrendered it, and when I glanced over at her in the middle of the meditation, she had this huge smile on her face, ear-to-ear smile. And I knew that she had released something. And when I asked her in the second half of the meditation, actually, when I asked the group to remind themselves who they did want to be and how they did want to live their life and to move into a new state of being. And a new state of being is a new personality. And a new personality creates a new personal reality. When they moved into that state of being, I said, now, as a quantum observer, what do you want? Come on, let those pictures come and observe destiny and allow those pictures to cause waves of probability to collapse into particles called an event or an experience in your life. And when she moved into this new state of being, she was no longer living by resentment and hatred and judgment. She was feeling joy and release and freedom. And she felt so great that she knew her focus was on abundance, but she didn't only want abundance for herself. She felt so great that she wanted abundance for everybody in the entire room. She went from being selfish to being selfless. She laid down the ego of being a somebody and became a nobody. And the moment she did that, she used that available energy to create a future destiny. Well, within 2 days, we finished the event on Sunday, and we drove home together. Within 2 days, her ex-husband sent her an email on that Tuesday morning saying that he was going to pay her the entirety of the child support money that he owed her, $11,000 plus, and he was going to deposit that money into her bank account that day. Now, she was so surprised by the experience. It came in such a way that she would least expect, that she says what everybody says when a new experience happens in her life. I don't believe this. Now, that's a good sign because all the emails that we get on the miracles that happen in people's lives always start out with the first sentence, you're not going to believe this. When you get to that point where the event happens in an unexpected way, that's the normal response. And so she said, I can't believe this. And within a very short amount of time, within that day, over $11,000 was deposited into her account. She no longer was connected to her ex-husband, her feeling judgment and resentment and hate, and him feeling guilt, shame, and unworthiness. She broke the bond of that emotional contract and liberated energy and gave him permission energetically to do the right thing and gave herself permission to no longer keep reality frozen as the day before. And that energy then reorganized itself into a new destiny, a whole new line of time.
This concludes The Reinvention of Self, a guide to changing your reality from the inside out. Volume 2 of the Question and Answer audio series with Dr. Joe Dispenza. For more information on other CDs of this Question and Answer audio series, plus DVDs, books, and workshops that Dr. Joe Dispenza now offers in the US and around the world, please visit his website at www.drjoedispenza.com. You can also stay up to date with Dr. Joe Dispenza via Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We hope you have enjoyed this recording.